That night, the British Empire still looked enormous on the map. Red-covered continents, trade routes spanned oceans. The illusion of dominance remained intact. But inside a room, under cold fluorescent light, Britain accepted something it had never admitted before. It was bankrupt. This was not the night Britain lost a war. It was the night Britain admitted it could no longer afford to win. For centuries, the British Empire had defined power itself. It controlled seas, finance, trade, and diplomacy. London was the center of the world's money. Sterling was trust. British credit was unquestioned. Britain did not just rule territory, it ruled the system. And that system had finally collapsed. The war had been won. Germany was defeated. The enemy was gone. The streets would soon fill with celebration. Flags would fly. Victory speeches would echo across Europe. But behind closed doors, Britain faced a reality far more dangerous than any army. There was no money left. The empire had survived the war by spending its future. Every ship built, every soldier paid, every ration delivered had been financed not by strength, but by debt. Britain had not fought the war on its own balance sheet. It had fought it on borrowed time. By the time victory arrived, the bill was unavoidable. That night, officials examined the numbers for the final time. Not projections, not estimates, reality. Gold reserves were gone. Foreign assets had been sold. Sterling was fragile. Imports could not be paid for without external help. Britain was still standing, but it was financially empty. The most painful truth was not that Britain was poor. It was that Britain could no longer pretend to be rich. The empire that had once financed the world now had to ask permission to feed itself. This was the night Britain accepted that it was no longer the global creditor. It was the debtor. The realization did not come suddenly. It had been building for years. The war had accelerated. Processes already in motion. Britain's industrial base was exhausted. Infrastructure was worn down. Cities were damaged. The population was tired. Victory had not brought relief. It had brought exposure. The United States had replaced Britain as the world's financial center. American factories were untouched. American reserves were full. American credit dictated terms. Britain understood what that meant. Power had crossed the Atlantic. That night, the discussion was not about ideology or pride. It was about survival, how to import food, how to stabilize the currency, how to avoid social collapse. There was no talk of empire. There was only accounting. For the first time in modern history, Britain had to consider a future where it was no longer the backbone of the global system, where colonies were liabilities instead of assets, where maintaining imperial commitments cost more than they returned. The empire had become too expensive. This was the core admission of that night. Britain had ruled the world because it could afford to. Now, it could not. The decision was not framed as surrender. It was framed as realism, adjustment, responsibility. But beneath the language, the meaning was clear. The age of British dominance was over. Britain would survive. The empire would not. That night did not end the British Empire, but it defined how it would end. Britain had won the war, but it had lost control of its finances. That was the contradiction no victory parade could hide. The factories were worn down. The workforce was exhausted. Infrastructure had been diverted entirely to survival. During the war, Britain had stopped exporting almost completely. Every resource was consumed internally, every output redirected to the front, and exports were how Britain paid for the world. Without them, the system collapsed quietly. For decades, Britain had lived off invisible income, investments abroad, shipping insurance, financial services, interest, payments flowing into London from across the empire. War cut those arteries one by one. Assets were sold to pay for weapons. Overseas investments were liquidated. The empire was slowly stripped to finance survival. By the end, there was nothing left to sell. Britain had entered the war as the world's banker. It emerged as its most indebted client. The numbers told a brutal story. Britain owed enormous sums to the United States, not symbolic debts, real obligations, interest-bearing loans, dollars that had to be repaid in a currency Britain could not easily earn. Sterling was no longer trusted automatically. Its value depended on American goodwill. Britain could print pounds, but it needed dollars to import food, fuel, and raw materials. And dollars were controlled elsewhere. This dependency changed everything. Economic policy was no longer sovereign. Decisions had to account for American reaction. Loans came with conditions. Aid came with expectations. The empire could not operate independently in a world where it no longer controlled credit. Britain had survived by postponing the reckoning. Wartime agreements, emergency measures, temporary arrangements, all designed to delay the moment when reality would assert itself. That moment had arrived. The empire was still vast on paper, but maintaining it required resources Britain no longer had. Garrisoning territories, administering colonies, protecting trade routes, these were expensive commitments, not sources of profit anymore. The calculation had flipped. Colonies once generated surplus. Now they consumed it. At the same time, political pressure mounted at home. The population had sacrificed for years. Rationing continued even after victory. Housing was scarce. Wages lagged behind prices. The promise of a better post-war life demanded fulfillment. The British government faced an impossible choice: preserve imperial commitments abroad or rebuild the country at home. It could not do both. This was the quiet core of the empire's collapse. Not rebellion, not invasion, budget constraints. Britain's leaders understood that clinging to empire would mean permanent austerity. Endless sacrifice for a structure that no longer paid for itself. Public tolerance for that was gone. The empire had become a burden. That night, in rooms filled with documents rather than maps, Britain accepted a reality it had resisted for decades. Global leadership requires surplus. Britain had none. Power was no longer measured by flags on maps, but by productive capacity, financial leverage, and growth. In all three, Britain was now behind. The United States was not hostile. It was simply dominant. American industry dwarfed British output. American reserves eclipsed British savings. American credit dictated global terms. The transfer of power was not dramatic. It was administrative. Britain adjusted its ambitions accordingly. Imperial retreat would not be framed as collapse. It would be framed as transition, decolonization, responsibility, partnership. But beneath the language, the truth remained. The empire was being dismantled because it could not be afforded. That night marked the point when Britain stopped pretending otherwise. The final admission did not come with a public announcement. There was no speech declaring bankruptcy, no headline saying the empire was finished. That is not how empires like Britain end. They end when reality is accepted quietly. By late 1945 and into 1946, Britain faced a simple, unforgiving equation. Without American support, the country would starve. Food imports could not be paid for. Fuel supplies were uncertain. Industrial recovery required raw materials Britain could no longer afford. Victory had delivered peace. Peace had delivered the bill. When emergency aid ended, Britain's position became undeniable. The country was not just short on cash, it was structurally insolvent. Its global obligations exceeded its capacity to generate surplus. The empire, once a source of strength, now drained resources Britain needed at home. This was the moment Britain accepted the truth it had been avoiding. It could not afford its empire. The decision was not made in one meeting or by one signature. It emerged from a series of unavoidable conclusions. Each option was examined. Each alternative failed. Maintain the empire and accept permanent austerity, or dismantle it and rebuild the nation. There was no third path. Britain chose survival. This choice reshaped the world. Colonial holdings were no longer defended at all costs. Military commitments were reduced. Independence movements were no longer crushed by default. Negotiation replaced force, because force was no longer affordable. The empire did not fall apart overnight. It was unwound. India, Palestine, Africa, Asia. Each withdrawal followed the same logic. Not defeat on the battlefield, but recognition in the treasury. The numbers no longer justified. Control. Britain did not lose its empire to rebellion alone. It lost it to accounting. This is the part history often disguises with language about morality and progress. Those forces mattered, but they were enabled by something more basic. Britain could no longer pay. The empire had been built in an era when trade dominance, naval supremacy, and financial leverage reinforced each other. By the mid-20th century, that system no longer existed. Industrial power had shifted, capital had moved, the rules of global leadership had changed. Britain had won the old game. It was losing the new one. Accepting bankruptcy was not humiliation, it was realism. Clinging to empire would have meant collapse at home. Britain chose to preserve the state by sacrificing the empire. That trade defined the post-war world. The British Empire did not collapse in flames. It did not disappear in a single treaty. It faded because it was no longer sustainable. That night mattered because it marked the psychological end. The moment when Britain stopped seeing itself as the center of the world and began seeing itself as one nation among others. Power had passed on. The empire's greatest strength, its global reach, had become its greatest weakness. Distance meant cost, control meant responsibility, responsibility meant expense, and Britain had no surplus left. The story of Britain's imperial end is not a story of failure, it is a story of limits. Even the most successful empire in history could not escape them. Victory did not save Britain's dominance, it exposed its fragility. The empire had financed the war had consumed the empire. That is the quiet irony of British history. The nation that stood alone against tyranny paid for that stand with its global position. It traded empire for survival. And it made the rational choice. Empires do not always fall when they are weak. Sometimes they fall when they are exhausted. The British Empire accepted its bankruptcy not as a confession of defeat, but as an acknowledgement of reality. And once that acknowledgement was made, the end was only a matter of time. Britain survived. The empire did not. That is what happened the night Britain accepted that it could no longer afford to rule the world. And once that truth was faced, history moved on.